I was a cave rescue specialist when the Ice Age apocalypse hit. 300 feet below the surface, I became the reluctant leader of 37 terrified survivors. The world above turned into a frozen wasteland within days. My specialized knowledge of underground survival kept us alive, but betrayal from within nearly destroyed everything we built. This is how I survived the first month when the planet froze over. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Gideon Carver, but most people know me as Echo. I've been a cave rescue specialist for 15 years, and I was 300 feet below the surface when the world froze over. What I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's the story of how specialized knowledge can mean the difference between life and death when everything falls apart. Before I get into how we survived, you need to understand who I was before the freeze. I started my career as a mine safety inspector in West Virginia. My father died in a preventable mine collapse when I was just a boy. Growing up without him, watching my mother struggle, I swore I'd make sure no other family went through that. For 12 years, I inspected mines, wrote citations, and fought with company men who cared more about quotas than human lives. But it wasn't enough. Everything changed with what we now call the pitfall incident. I was leading a routine inspection of a new shaft when the support structures failed. The main tunnel collapsed, trapping me and 7 miners almost half a mile underground. We had limited air, limited water, and no direct way to communicate with the surface. Standard rescue protocols said we were already dead. But I refused to accept that. I mapped every inch of our prison, testing airflows, listening to the rock, looking for any weakness we could exploit. 3 of the miners panicked, tried to dig through an unstable section against my warnings. The secondary collapse killed them instantly. The rest of us had no choice but to go deeper, away from the rescue teams who would be approaching from above. For 9 days, we navigated through crevices barely wide enough for a human body. We drank water that dripped from stalactites. We fought the darkness, the cold, the fear that we'd be forgotten. When we finally emerged from an abandoned air shaft 2 miles from the original collapse site, the media called it a miracle. I called it applying the right knowledge under pressure. Those bodies still haunt me. Their faces in the darkness, their voices in the silence. After that, I couldn't go back to just writing citations. I joined a specialized cave rescue team, developed equipment specifically designed for tight spaces and low visibility. I modified standard breathing apparatus to last longer in confined spaces. I created lighting systems that could function for days on minimal power. I became obsessive about preparation, about knowing every possible exit route before entering any space. The caving community started calling me Echo, the man who always finds a way out. Not because I was loud, but because I could navigate by sound, tapping on walls and listening to the resonance to map spaces I couldn't see. In the dark, your ears become more valuable than your eyes. The Cumberland Cave System in Kentucky became my second home. It's one of the largest cave networks in the country, over 400 mapped miles with countless unmapped branches and chambers. I knew sections of it better than I knew my own apartment. The day everything changed, I was running a training exercise with 4 volunteers, teaching them techniques for extracting injured cavers from tight vertical shafts. There had been warnings, of course. Scientists had been talking about climate instability for years. The weather had been getting increasingly unpredictable, record heat waves followed by freak snowstorms. Just the week before, there had been unusual aurora activity visible much farther south than normal. But like most people, I dismissed these as temporary anomalies. Just another cold snap, I thought. I'd seen plenty. I was checking the training equipment that morning when my radio started picking up emergency broadcasts. At first, I only half listened. Weather alerts had become common, but this one was different. Attention all citizens. This is not a test. The National Weather Service has confirmed an unprecedented polar weather system descending across the continental United States. Temperatures are expected to drop below 0 in all 50 states within 72 hours. Seek shelter immediately. I repeat, this is not a test. Even then, I wasn't truly alarmed. Emergency services tend to overreact. Better safe than sorry, right? But then all our radios started receiving the same message, overriding every channel. My phone buzzed with the emergency alert, and then the cave entrance darkened as people began rushing in. The sheriff came first with his family in tow. I'd met him a few times during safety coordination meetings. Behind him came a stream of townspeople. Some I recognized, most I didn't. They carried whatever they could grab: blankets, canned food, flashlights. Their faces showed something I recognized from the pitfall: raw fear. "Echo," the sheriff said, grabbing my arm. "The entire town's losing power. Temperatures dropped 30 degrees in the last hour. They're saying it might hit 40 below by nightfall. This place is the only shelter deep enough to survive that kind of cold." I stepped toward the entrance to see for myself. The sky had turned a color I'd never seen before, a sickly greenish gray, like bruised skin. The wind whipped with such force that it tore branches from trees. And the cold. I'd felt deep cold before, the kind that lives in caves, but this was different. This cold burned. My exposed skin felt like it was being pressed with hot metal after just seconds of exposure. Inside the cave, chaos was spreading. People who had never spent a single night away from electric lights and central heating were now faced with darkness and stone. Children were crying. Adults were arguing over space and supplies. Someone had brought a dog that wouldn't stop barking, the sound echoing off the walls and multiplying the sense of panic. I never wanted to be in charge. I just knew what needed doing. First, I got everyone away from the entrance, deeper into the system where the temperature would remain constant regardless of what happened outside. The tourist section of Cumberland has paved pathways and safety railings for the first quarter mile. Beyond that, it gets more challenging, but the main chambers are still accessible to anyone reasonably fit. "Everyone listen up," I shouted, using the voice I'd developed for rescue situations, calm but authoritative. "This cave maintains a constant temperature of 54 degrees year-round. No matter what happens outside, we're safe from the cold here. But we need organization if we're going to make this work." I took a quick inventory. 37 people had made it inside. Among them, the sheriff and his family, a doctor and her teenage son, a high school science teacher, several families from town, the manager of the local grocery store, a banker, a couple of college students who had been hiking nearby, and my 4 training volunteers who at least had some basic cave knowledge. That first night was the hardest. Many had cell phones, but no way to charge them once the batteries died. The few flashlights and lanterns people had brought wouldn't last long. Most weren't dressed for cave conditions, damp and cool with uneven footing, and the psychological weight of being underground was already affecting some. A woman with claustrophobia had to be sedated with the doctor's emergency kit. I established basic rules immediately. No one ventures anywhere alone. Water is rationed. All food is communal. And waste is managed in designated areas away from our living space. My volunteers helped me set up a basic camp in the largest chamber, using the supplies people had brought to create some semblance of comfort. Outside, we could occasionally hear the storm raging. The wind made strange sounds as it whipped past the cave entrance, sometimes a howl, sometimes almost like words. The temperature continued to drop. One of my temperature gauges, placed near the entrance, registered 60 below zero before it stopped working entirely. I tried to sleep that first night, but couldn't. Part of it was responsibility. I kept getting up to check on different groups to make sure no one had wandered off. But part of it was the dreams that came whenever I closed my eyes. I saw the men I couldn't save in the pitfall, their faces pale in the beam of my headlamp. Only now there were dozens more faces in the darkness, faces I recognized from our new group. By morning, though we could only tell it was morning from our watches, the reality of our situation had settled in. This wasn't a temporary shelter from a passing storm. The radio broadcasts, when we could get them, spoke of national emergency, conditions, of power grids failing across the country, of temperatures continuing to drop beyond all predictions. "We need to get organized for the long haul," I told the group after a meager breakfast of granola bars and bottled water. "We have no idea how long we'll need to stay down here, but we need to operate under the assumption that it could be weeks. I divided people into teams based on their skills and physical capabilities. The doctor, Lisa Chen, would handle medical needs and hygiene education. The science teacher, Rodriguez, knew enough geology to help me map our usable space. The grocery manager, Hernandez, took charge of inventory and rationing. The sheriff maintained security and dispute resolution. That left me free to focus on our most immediate concern, assessing conditions outside and figuring out our resource situation. I needed to get to my truck, which contained my specialized equipment cache, better lights, tools, emergency rations, and most importantly, my more sophisticated radio equipment that might pick up transmissions from emergency services. I selected 2 of my volunteers to accompany me. Davis, a former military man with survival training, and Danielle, a geological engineering student. We dressed in every layer we could find, covering all exposed skin. I insisted we tie ourselves, together with rope, the way mountain climbers do in whiteout conditions. Nothing could have prepared us for what we found outside. The world had disappeared under white. The parking lot was buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. Cars were completely covered, just vague humps in the white landscape. The trees that had lined the road were now bent almost double under the weight of ice, creating a tunnel of frozen wood. The cold hit like a physical blow. Even through layers of clothing, it penetrated immediately. Every breath felt like inhaling glass shards. Our exposed skin began to hurt within seconds, then burn, then go numb. The progression of frostbite accelerated by the extreme temperature. We found my truck, half buried but still accessible. Inside was my equipment cache, waterproof containers, with everything we might need for extended underground operations. It took us 3 trips to get it all back to the cave, each journey more painful than the last. By the 3rd trip, I couldn't feel my feet or fingers, despite the precautions. Back inside, as feeling painfully returned to my extremities, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what we were facing. This wasn't just a severe winter storm. Something had fundamentally shifted in our world. And if we were going to survive it, we would need to adapt faster than most people ever had to. That night, I dreamed again of the pitfall, but this time, when the men died in the secondary collapse, their bodies didn't stay where they fell. They rose and followed us deeper into the cave, their footsteps echoing behind us no matter how far we went. I woke with their whispers still in my ears. You can't outrun what's coming, Echo. You can only hope to outlast it. That first morning, in the cave, I woke to the sounds of children crying and adults arguing in hushed voices. Reality was setting in. This wasn't a temporary situation. We were looking at an extended period underground, and most of these people had never spent more than a tourist visit in a cave. I gathered everyone together to establish some ground rules and organization. The tourist section of Cumberland Caves is just the beginning, I explained. There are miles of passages beyond, but they require knowledge to navigate safely. No one goes anywhere without my approval and a guide who knows what they're doing. We needed to convert this space from a tourist attraction to a livable shelter. The main chamber became our central living area. Side passages were designated for sleeping, organized by family groups. One chamber with good ventilation became our kitchen area. Another, farther from the main living spaces, was set up for sanitation. Water wasn't an immediate concern. Caves typically have natural water sources, and Cumberland had several. I showed people how to collect drip water from stalactites, which is naturally filtered through limestone and remarkably pure. We set up plastic tarps to funnel and collect larger amounts. For drinking water, this was sufficient. For washing, we had a small underground stream in one of the lower chambers. The biggest immediate challenge was light. Most people had brought flashlights or lanterns, but batteries wouldn't last long. From my equipment cache, I distributed specialized LED headlamps designed for caving, efficient and durable. But even these had limited battery life. I established strict rules about when lights could be used and began teaching everyone how to move safely in low-light conditions. Your eyes will adapt, I assured them. Humans aren't naturally afraid of the dark. That's a learned response. Underground darkness is your friend because it conserves resources. The second day I organized another expedition to the surface, this time with 4 people. We needed to assess the town situation and gather whatever supplies we could find. The temperatures outside had stabilized around 40 below zero, still lethal but at least not dropping further. What we found was sobering. The small town of Cumberland had been effectively abandoned. Power lines had collapsed under the weight of ice. Houses stood dark and freezing. In some homes we found people who hadn't evacuated in time, already frozen. I insisted we cover these bodies with blankets, partly out of respect, partly to protect my team's mental health. I'd seen death before, but not like this, not whole. Families huddled together, frozen in their final moments. We focused our scavenging efforts on the town grocery store. Hernandez, the store manager, was with us and had keys. Inside, the store was dark and already growing cold, but the food was still good. We took everything we could carry: canned goods, dried foods, anything that wouldn't require cooking. We also grabbed blankets, medicine, batteries, and other essentials from the pharmacy section. It took 3 more expeditions over the next 2 days to gather enough supplies. Each trip was dangerous. The cold was unrelenting, and the snow continued to pile up, making navigation increasingly difficult. But by our 5th day underground, we had enough food for about 3 weeks if we were careful with rationing. That's when the first serious conflict erupted. Tom Sullivan, the town banker, approached me with a proposal. He was a tall man, used to being listened to, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of people needing your approval. "Carver, we need to discuss resource allocation," he said, gesturing to a small group of men standing behind him. "Some people here have skills that will be more valuable for rebuilding once this crisis passes. Those people need proper nutrition to maintain their strength and mental acuity." What he was suggesting was preferential treatment, larger rations, for himself and his chosen few. Underground, there are no CEOs or janitors. Everyone's survival depends on everyone else's well-being. I'd seen this kind of power play in disaster situations before, and it needed to be shut down immediately. "Let me explain something, Sullivan," I said, loud enough for others to hear. "Down here, your bank account means nothing. Your job title means nothing. The only currency that matters is what you contribute to group survival. Right now, the people pulling the most weight are the ones hauling water and setting up sanitation systems. You want extra rations? Join them." His face flushed with anger, but he backed down when he saw he had no support. Most people understood, intuitively, what I'd learned through hard experience. In survival situations, equality isn't just moral, it's practical. Resentment breeds conflict, and conflict kills faster than cold or hunger. After that confrontation, I decided we needed a formal leadership structure. I established a council with representatives from different backgrounds and skills: Lisa, the doctor for medical concerns; Rodriguez, the science teacher for education and technical problems; Hernandez for inventory management; the sheriff for security; Danielle for geological expertise; and myself for overall cave operations. Sullivan was deliberately not included. This structure helped smooth operations over the next few days, but I noticed tensions still simmering. Resource anxiety was growing. People were calculating how long our food would last, how long we might need to stay underground. And I noticed Marcus, a quiet man who had arrived alone, watching our food inventory sessions with too much interest. At the time, I didn't think much of it. That was my first mistake. By day 7, we had established a routine. Wake at the same time each day as indicated by watches. Meals at regular intervals. Work shifts for essential tasks like water collection and sanitation maintenance. Even educational sessions for the children, led by Rodriguez, who turned the cave itself into a science classroom. But living underground takes a psychological toll. Humans aren't meant to live without sunlight, without the natural rhythm of day and night. Some people adapted well. Others began showing signs of cave psychosis, disorientation, anxiety, sleep disturbances. Lisa and I worked together to identify those struggling and developed interventions: regular exercise in the larger chambers, light therapy using our brightest lamps for short periods, meditation techniques I'd learned for managing fear in confined spaces. "The cave will speak to you," I told the group during one session. After enough time down here, you'll start to hear voices in the water drips and the subtle air movements. That's normal. Your brain is trying to create patterns from random stimuli because it's used to a more sensory-rich environment. Acknowledge it, but don't engage with it. By the second week, we had begun to notice wildlife seeking shelter in the outer portions of the cave. Bats, of course. They're natural cave dwellers. But also squirrels, raccoons, even a few deer hovering near the entrance, driven by desperation to overcome their natural fear of enclosed spaces. Even the creatures that lived above ground knew where safety lay beneath the surface. This presented both opportunities and challenges. Additional food sources, potentially, but also competition for space and concerns about disease. I established hunting parties for the cave entrance areas, where some animals could be taken without depleting their populations entirely. My years in Appalachia had taught me basic hunting and trapping skills, which I now passed on to others. The wildlife behavior reinforced what our intermittent radio contact was telling us. The world above remained in deep freeze. The few broadcasts we could pick up spoke of nationwide power failures, of fuel shortages preventing effective emergency response, of death tolls rising into the hundreds of thousands. Major cities were being evacuated to underground facilities, subway tunnels, mine shafts, anything below the frost line. It became clear that our initial food supplies, even with careful rationing and supplementary hunting, wouldn't sustain us indefinitely. We needed to expand our territory to find additional resources and, perhaps most importantly, to give people hope of improvement rather than just prolonged survival. I selected a team of our most physically capable members, including 2 of my original volunteers, to explore deeper into the cave system. Cumberland has over 400 mapped miles, but I knew there were unmapped branches with potential resources, other water sources, possibly even different cave entrances that could give us access to other buildings for scavenging. Before leaving on this exploration, I pulled Davis aside. "Keep an eye on Marcus while I'm gone," I told him. "I've seen him watching our food stores. Could be nothing, but in my experience, people who pay too much attention to resources often have plans for them." Davis nodded. He understood the psychology of scarcity from his military days. Our exploration team ventured beyond the tourist areas into the true cave system. Here, the passages narrowed, the footing became treacherous, and the absolute darkness swallowed our headlamps within feet. I led the way, using techniques I'd developed over years of cave rescue, testing each step, listening to the acoustics around us, feeling air movements that hinted at larger spaces ahead. After several hours of careful progress, we found what I had been hoping for, a massive chamber that had been overlooked by the commercial mapping expeditions. It was roughly circular, about 100 feet in diameter, with a high ceiling that disappeared beyond our light beams. The floor was relatively flat, and there was a small underground spring bubbling from one wall, creating a shallow pool before disappearing again into the rock. "This could be our new main base," I said, my voice echoing in the vast space. "More room for everyone, better water source, and farther from the entrance, which means better temperature stability." As we explored this chamber, Danielle, the geological engineering student, made an even more exciting discovery. She called me over to a narrow crack in the far wall where a distinct warm breeze was flowing. "Feel this," she said, guiding my hand to the opening. "That's geothermally heated air. There might be a connection to a deeper level with thermal activity." This was potentially game-changing. Geothermal heat could provide not just warmth, but also possibilities for cooking and potentially even power generation with the right equipment. I made a mental note to prioritize further exploration in this direction once we'd relocated the group. We mapped our route carefully on the way back, placing reflective markers at key junction points. The main group received our report with enthusiasm. The prospect of a better living space gave people something positive to focus on. We began planning a gradual relocation, starting with moving supplies and setting up basic infrastructure in the new chamber. For the first time in 10 days, I heard laughter echoing off the walls. The discovery had given people hope, something to work toward, rather than just survive through. Even Sullivan seemed to have dropped his power plays and was helping organize the relocation logistics. That night I slept better than I had since this all began. The dreams of the pitfall incident still came, but now when the men died in the collapse, I could show their spirits the new chamber, the warm air vent, the signs of possible long-term survival. Their accusing expressions softened, just slightly. The next morning, we began moving essential supplies to the new chamber. The route was challenging, about a mile of irregular cave passages including 2 tight squeezes and a short climb, but manageable for most of our group with assistance. We sent the strongest people first to set up a base camp, then began rotating others through in small groups. By evening, about half our supplies and a third of our people had relocated. The rest were packed and ready to move the following day. I was making a final check of the tourist area when Sheriff Matthews approached me, his expression grim. "We may have a problem," he said quietly. 2 men are missing. Marcus and one of the college students, Kevin. No one has seen them since midday, and some medical supplies are unaccounted for. My instincts had been right about Marcus, but I hadn't acted quickly enough. We organized a search party immediately, checking all the passages we'd used regularly. There was no sign of them in any of the mapped areas. That left only one possibility. They had either gone to the surface or ventured into unmapped passages without proper equipment or knowledge. Neither option was good. The surface remained lethal without proper gear, and uncharted cave passages kill even experienced cavers who make small mistakes. I gathered a specialized search team, myself, Davis with his military tracking skills, and Danielle with her geological knowledge. We need to find them before they get themselves killed or, worse, collapse a passage that cuts us off from our new chamber, I explained. As we prepared to begin our search, one of the kids ran up to us, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "Mr. Echo, I found something weird when I was exploring with my dad. There's a little passage behind the big column in the new big room. It's small, but I could see light coming from the other side." Kids and their natural curiosity often discovered things adults missed. I immediately redirected our search team to the new chamber. Sure enough, behind a large stalagmite formation, there was a tight passage barely visible unless you were looking for it, and from within a faint glow of light was visible. "This could lead to an entirely new section," I said, examining the narrow opening, "and I'd bet that's where our missing people went." The passage was tight, a squeeze in caving terminology, but passable for an adult if you knew how to position your body. I went first, compressing my chest and extending my arms forward, using cave movement techniques I'd perfected over years. The others followed, one by one. After about 20 feet of claustrophobic crawling, the passage suddenly opened up. We found ourselves in a tunnel that showed signs of human modification. Old wooden support beams, rusted rail spikes embedded in the floor. This was part of an old mining operation that had intersected the natural cave system, probably from the early coal mining days in Kentucky. The lights we had glimpsed came from around a bend in the tunnel. As we approached cautiously, I heard voices, Marcus and Kevin, but also others I didn't recognize. I signaled for my team to stop and listen. "We've got at least 30 people back there," Marcus was saying. "Good supplies, medicine, batteries. They've got a doctor and a cave expert leading them." An unfamiliar voice responded, "How well armed are they?" "Just the sheriff has a gun that I know of. The rest are civilians, town people. They won't put up much resistance." They were planning a raid on our group. In the desperate world the freeze had created, our relatively well-organized community with its supplies and expertise had become a target. And Marcus was the inside man. I gestured my team back into the passage. Once safely out of earshot, I outlined what we'd learned and what it meant. "There's another group of survivors using these old mining tunnels. They're desperate or predatory, maybe both. And they now know about us thanks to Marcus. We needed to get back and prepare our people, to secure our supplies and set up defenses." But as we turned to leave, a small rock dislodged from the ceiling, clattering down the passage. The voices stopped immediately. "Someone's there," the unknown voice said sharply. "Check it out." We had no choice. We scrambled back into the tight passage, moving as quickly as possible while trying to stay quiet. I heard footsteps behind us gaining quickly as we struggled through the confined space. Just as we emerged back into our new chamber, I heard Marcus's voice call out, "Wait, don't shoot. It's probably just some of the kids exploring." I turned to Davis. "Get everyone moved to the new chamber now. All of them. We might not have much time." He nodded grimly and took off at a run. I stayed at the passage entrance with Danielle, planning our next steps. If a hostile group was about to emerge from that hole, we needed to be ready. But I also couldn't risk violence that might trigger a cave-in or damage our water sources. "There's a flat stone slab by the pool," I told Danielle. "Get help and move it here. We're going to seal this passage temporarily." She understood immediately and hurried off. I stayed, watching the small opening, listening intently for any sound of approach. My headlamp illuminated the tight passage, and for a moment I glimpsed a face peering back at me from the darkness. Not Marcus or Kevin, but a stranger with hollow cheeks and calculating eyes. Then it vanished, pulling back into the shadows. I knew that face would return, and next time it wouldn't be alone. Danielle returned quickly with 4 strong men and the stone slab I'd spotted earlier. It was roughly oval, about 4 feet wide and 6 inches thick, a piece of fallen ceiling. From years ago, they positioned it over the narrow passage entrance while I kept watch for any sign of pursuit. "We're not sealing it permanently," I explained as they worked, "just making it difficult enough that they can't come through quickly. We need time to prepare." Once the stone was in place, braced with smaller rocks, I hurried back to oversee the emergency relocation. Davis had already mobilized everyone, explaining the situation without causing panic. People were gathering their essentials, the stronger ones helping the elderly and children. Hernandez and his team were rapidly packing our food supplies. "How much time do we have?" Sheriff Matthews asked me, checking his pistol, the only firearm in our group. "Hard to say. They'll need to find another way around since we've blocked their direct approach. That could take hours or days, depending on their knowledge of the cave system." We worked through what would have been night had we been able to see the sky. Every person carried what they could manage. The children formed a chain to move smaller items. Even Sullivan pitched in without complaint, the threat of outside raiders apparently enough to put our earlier conflicts in perspective. By what our watches told us was morning, we had completely relocated to the new chamber. It was a better, defensive position. One main access tunnel that could be monitored, high ceilings that dispersed our lamplight to create less obvious shadows, and multiple small alcoves where supplies or vulnerable people could be hidden. I called the council together to develop a security plan. The sheriff would organize a rotating watch at the main entrance tunnel. I would train a small team in cave defensive tactics, how to use the natural environment to our advantage. Danielle would work on mapping possible escape routes if we needed to abandon this chamber in a hurry. "What about Marcus and Kevin?" Lisa asked. "They were part of our group. They know you, Echo, know how you think." She was right, and it worried me. Marcus had been watching us for days, maybe longer. He knew our routines, our resources, our strengths and weaknesses, and he'd had time to share all that information with whoever was on the other side of that passage. "We adapt," I said simply. "Change our patterns, set up decoys, and prepare for the worst while hoping they simply decide we're too much trouble." But hope has never been a strategy I rely on. I've survived by preparing for the worst-case scenario and working backward from there. And the worst case here was disturbing: armed hostiles with inside knowledge of our group, targeting our supplies in an environment where any firefight could trigger a deadly cave-in. I selected 5 people with the right combination of physical capability and level-headedness to form our security team. Davis, obviously, with his military background; Danielle, who knew the geology; Rodriguez, who had proven surprisingly resourceful; a woman named Claire, who had been a park ranger and knew wilderness survival; and Sarah, one of my original training volunteers who moved through caves like she was born in them. For 3 days we prepared. I showed them how to set up early warning systems using fishing line and small rocks that would clatter down if disturbed. How to create choke points with strategically placed supplies that could be pulled down to block passages. How to move silently through water to avoid detection. Most importantly, how to use the cave's acoustics to our advantage. Certain spots where sounds carried clearly, others where they were muffled or distorted. The rest of the group continued establishing our new living space. The chamber's natural features made it surprisingly suitable. The spring provided clean water. Small side passages offered privacy. The high ceiling prevented the carbon dioxide buildup that can make enclosed spaces dangerous over time. On the fourth day after our relocation, our warning system triggered. Someone was approaching through the main access tunnel. I deployed our security team according to our plan, concealed at different positions along the tunnel, with the rest of our group moved to the rear of the main chamber. The sheriff stood openly at the chamber entrance, his hand near but not on his weapon. I stayed slightly behind him, watching and listening. Two figures appeared at the tunnel's bend, illuminated by our positioned lights. Marcus and Kevin, alone, hands raised to show they were unarmed. "We need to talk," Marcus called out. "We're coming in peacefully." The sheriff looked at me questioningly. I nodded slightly. Let them approach but not enter the chamber. As they came closer, I could see Marcus looked worse for wear. A fresh cut across his forehead, bruising around one eye. Kevin just looked, terrified. "That's far enough," the sheriff said when they were about 20 feet away. "Say what you came to say." Marcus swallowed hard. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. There's a group in the mining tunnels, about 15 people. They're armed. They've been raiding other survivor groups for supplies. They found me when I was scouting the old mining entrance a week ago. Said they'd kill me unless I helped them." "And now?" I asked. "They sent us to negotiate. They want half your supplies and they'll leave you alone. Otherwise, they're coming tomorrow and they'll take everything." Classic raider tactics. Use intimidation to get compliance, minimize resistance. I'd seen it before in disaster zones, but something felt off about Marcus's story. "Why the change of heart?" I pressed. "Yesterday you were telling them all about us, now you're warning us?" Kevin spoke up, his voice shaking. "They killed 2 people last night. A man and woman who'd been with them but tried to leave. Shot them, right in front of us. They're not just raiders, they're murderers." That matched the hollow-eyed look I'd seen on both their faces. They'd witnessed something that had shaken their worldview, made them reconsider their choices. Whether that made them trustworthy was another question entirely. "Who's their leader?" I asked. Marcus hesitated. "A guy named Johnson. Used to be some kind of contractor, I think." The name hit me like a physical blow. Johnson. There aren't many Johnsons in cave rescue circles, but one in particular had reason to hate me. "Describe him," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tall, beard, scar through his right eyebrow. Has a weird accent like he's from the mountains. Thomas Johnson. My former teammate from the Pitfall incident. He'd been on the surface team when the collapse happened, had argued against my unconventional escape plan, insisted they should follow standard protocols even though I knew that would mean death for all of us. When we emerged from that abandoned airshaft miles away, proving him wrong, he'd left the rescue team. Last I'd heard, he'd gone into private security contracting. The coincidence was too much. Of all the people to encounter in this frozen apocalypse, it had to be the man who blamed me for risking lives unnecessarily, who never acknowledged that my unorthodox approach had saved 4 of the 7 trapped miners. "I know him," I said simply. The sheriff glanced at me sharply, hearing something in my voice. "And he knows me. This isn't a random raider group. This is personal." I made a quick decision. "Marcus, Kevin, you can rejoin us under supervision. I need to know everything about their operation. Numbers, weapons, positions." As they were escorted into the chamber by Davis and Claire, I pulled the rest of the council aside. "This changes things. Johnson knows how I think, knows my rescue techniques. He'll anticipate standard defensive measures." "So what do we do?" Rodriguez asked. I thought of the warm air current Danielle had discovered earlier. "We find another way out. Something he won't expect." I assembled a specialized exploration team, myself, Danielle, and Sarah. Our mission was clear. Follow that thermal air current and see if it led to another chamber or passage that could serve. as either a defensive position or an evacuation route if needed. The crack where we'd felt the warm air was barely wide enough to squeeze through sideways. Danielle went first, being the slimmest. I followed, the rough stones scraping against my chest and back. Sarah came last, our lifeline to the main group. Beyond the crack, we found a sloping passage that descended steeply. The air grew noticeably warmer, and the walls were dry to the touch, unusual in cave systems where moisture is typically omnipresent. After about 100 yards of careful descent, the passage opened suddenly into complete darkness. Our headlamps couldn't find the opposite wall or ceiling. "This is big," Danielle whispered, her voice immediately swallowed by the space. I took a small rock and tossed it directly ahead. We waited. After almost 3 seconds, we heard it hit water with a distinct plop. "There's a pool or underground lake down there," I said. "Let's proceed carefully." We made our way down to what turned out to be a massive chamber, easily 3 times the size of our current living space. The floor sloped gradually toward a black pool of water that disappeared into darkness. The temperature here was noticeably warmer, perhaps 65 degrees, practically tropical compared to the 54 degrees we'd been living with. Danielle examined the walls with her geological expertise. "This is definitely geothermal activity. See how the rock is different? Here, there must be a heat source relatively close beneath us." We explored the chamber thoroughly, mapping its dimensions and features. The warm air made it immediately appealing as living space, but the large water body was concerning. Underground lakes can rise rapidly with rainfall or snowmelt. However, it also provided an abundance of water and possibly even food if it contained cave-adapted fish or crustaceans. Most importantly, we discovered 3 additional passages leading from this chamber in different directions. Any of them could potentially provide alternative routes to the surface or to other parts of the cave system. "This is perfect," I said, as we completed our initial survey. "Johnson won't know about this. We can move our most vulnerable people here immediately, and if necessary, evacuate everyone." We were preparing to return to the main group with our discovery when we heard it, a distant rumble that grew into a roar. The ground beneath us trembled slightly. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling. "Cave-in," I said, recognizing the sound instantly. "Let's move!" We rushed back up the sloping passage toward the crack that would lead us to our people, but when we reached it, we found our way blocked. The small opening had collapsed, sealed by fallen rock. We were cut off from the main chamber and our group. Separated from all our supplies, from the children and elderly we were responsible, from the people who were counting on my knowledge to keep them alive. "Can we dig through?" Sarah asked, already examining the blockage. I ran my hands along the fallen rocks, testing for stability. "Not safely. This whole section is unstable now. Any more disturbance could bring down the ceiling on both sides." "What caused it?" Danielle asked. "Seismic activity, natural settling?" My mind went to darker possibilities. Or someone setting charges in the old mining tunnels. Johnson would know how to do that safely, where to place them for maximum effect. Whether accident or deliberate act, the result was the same. Our group was now divided, with no direct communication possible. Those in the main chamber would have no idea what had happened to us or where to look. And we had limited supplies, just what we'd brought for a few hours of exploration. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her normally confident voice shaking slightly. I took a deep breath, calming myself the way I'd taught others to do in crisis situations. "We explore the other passages from the thermal chamber. Find another way around to the main group. If Johnson is making his move, our people will need us." We returned to the large thermal chamber and examined our options more carefully. 3 passages led away from the lake. One continued downward, following the water's apparent path. Another climbed steadily upward. The third remained relatively level but narrowed quickly. "The upward route is our best bet," I decided. It might connect to known passages above us or even reach the surface eventually. We proceeded carefully, conserving our light sources and marking our path with small cairns of stacked stones. The passage climbed steadily through a series of switchbacks and small chambers. In places, we had to use basic climbing techniques to navigate short vertical sections. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes according to Sarah's watch, We reached a junction where our passage intersected a horizontal tunnel that showed signs of human modification: old timber supports, rusted metal, tracks in the floor. "We're in the mining section," I said, recognizing the characteristics instantly. This could connect to where Johnson's group is based, or lead to a different section of the cave entirely. We had to make a choice: continue upward in hopes of finding a route back to our people, or follow the mining tunnel to potentially gather intelligence on Johnson's group. Both options carried significant risks. If we find Johnson's base, we might learn what happened to our group, I reasoned. And if they've attacked our people, we need to know. Danielle and Sarah nodded in agreement. We turned into the mining tunnel, moving as silently as possible, headlamps dimmed to minimize the chance of detection. The tunnel showed increasing signs of recent human activity: footprints in the dust, occasional food wrappers, a discarded battery. We were definitely on the right track. After about a quarter mile, we began to hear voices echoing faintly from ahead. We doused our lights completely and proceeded by touch, pressing close to the wall. The voices grew louder. I could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, one of them with the distinctive mountain accent I remembered from Johnson. "They've gone to ground," Johnson was saying. "That collapse cut off our direct access. We'll need to find another way in." "What about the people we sent to negotiate?" another voice asked. "If Carver lets them back in, they'll report as instructed. If not, they're on their own." So Marcus and Kevin had been sent as unwitting scouts to report back on our defenses and numbers. Their story about witnessing murders might have been true, but their change of heart was certainly prompted by Johnson. "How do you know this Carver guy won't just lead them deeper into the system where we can't follow?" a third voice questioned. Johnson's laugh was bitter. "Because I know Echo. He won't run. He'll stand and fight for those people the same way he did at Pitfall, no matter the cost. His hero complex won't let him do anything else." I flinched at hearing my cave nickname from his mouth. Johnson had always used it sarcastically, even before our falling out. "We rest for 4 hours, then proceed with the southern approach. Their water source is there. We control that. We control everything." This was valuable intelligence. Johnson planned to attack through a passage that approached our spring. But I also realized something crucial. He didn't know about the thermal chamber or the underground lake. Our discovery had just become even more important. We retreated silently the way we had come, not daring to speak until we were well away from their voices. Back at the junction, we continued our upward climb, more determined than ever to find a way back to our group. The passage grew increasingly narrow and challenging. In some places, we had to remove our packs and push them ahead of us to squeeze through. The air became noticeably cooler, suggesting we were moving away from the geothermal influence. After another hour of difficult progress, we emerged suddenly into a small chamber with multiple passages leading off in different directions. One of them had a familiar marker: 3 small stones stacked in a specific pattern. One of my trail signs. "We're back in mapped territory," I said with relief. "This connects to areas we've explored before." We followed my markers through a complex series of turns and chambers, eventually recognizing features that told us we were approaching our main chamber from above and behind, the opposite direction from where Johnson would be expecting an approach. When we finally reached the edge of our living chamber, we paused to assess the situation below. Our people were there, apparently unharmed, but in a state of high alert. Sentries were positioned at the main entrance. Supplies had been reorganized into defensive barriers. The sheriff and Davis were consulting over what looked like a crude map. We called down softly, identifying ourselves before emerging fully. The relief on people's faces was palpable as we descended to rejoin them. "We thought you were dead," Rodriguez said, clasping my shoulder. "When the collapse happened, and you didn't return." "What caused it?" I asked immediately. "We're not sure," Davis answered. "Could have been natural settling, could have been deliberate. Marcus and Kevin say Johnson's group has explosives." I quickly briefed the council on what we'd discovered: the thermal chamber, the underground lake, the overheard conversation about Johnson's planned attack. "This changes everything," I said. We now have a safe fallback position unknown to Johnson, and we know his next move. We can prepare accordingly. As I outlined my proposed strategy, I caught Lisa watching me with an unreadable expression. When the others dispersed to implement our plans, she approached me. "You know this, Johnson personally," she said. It wasn't a question. From the pitfall incident, he was on the surface team, thought my approach was reckless. And now he's here leading raiders specifically targeting your group. She studied my face carefully. "That's not coincidence, Echo. That's fate." "I don't believe in fate. I believe in preparation, in knowledge, in making your own luck." But standing there, planning for a confrontation with a man who had once been a colleague in a frozen apocalypse neither of us could have imagined, it was hard not to feel that larger forces were at work. "Coincidence or fate, it doesn't change what we need to do," I replied. "We protect our people, we survive." But as I moved to check our defenses, I couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation had been building since that moment in the pitfall, when Johnson and I had argued over the right approach to saving lives. Now, as then, lives hung in the balance of our opposing philosophies, and this time the stakes were even higher. My detailed report on Johnson's imminent attack changed our defensive strategy completely. Instead of fortifying the main entrance where he'd expect resistance, we prepared an elaborate misdirection. We maintained visible sentries there, but secretly relocated our vulnerable population, children, elderly, and those with medical conditions, to the newly discovered thermal chamber, along with critical supplies. Lisa and Rodriguez accompanied them to provide medical care and leadership. "If anything happens to the main group, they'll need someone who knows how to organize," I explained to Rodriguez. He nodded gravely, understanding the responsibility I was placing on him. The rest of us split into 3 teams. The first, led by the sheriff, would maintain our visible presence in the main chamber, enough people to look like our full group from a distance. The second team, led by Davis, would position themselves near our water source where Johnson planned to attack. But instead of defending it directly, they would set up our early warning systems and prepare for a strategic withdrawal. I would lead the third team, consisting of Danielle, Sarah, and 2 others with cave experience. Our job was to circle around through the mining tunnels we'd discovered and approach Johnson's group from behind. Not to attack, we were outnumbered and outgunned, but to gather intelligence and, if possible, create a distraction that would divide their forces. As we finalized preparations, I pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. Since his return, he'd been kept under supervision but had cooperated fully, providing detailed information about Johnson's group. Still, I didn't fully trust his change of heart. "I need to understand," I said, studying his face carefully. "Why did you betray us in the first place?" "The truth, this time." Marcus looked away, shame evident in his posture. "Johnson's people found me during an early scouting mission. They had my wife and daughter. Took them when the freeze first hit. Said they'd hurt them if I didn't help." This was different from what he'd told us earlier. "Your family? You came to the cave alone." "Because they weren't with me when it happened. They were visiting her mother in Lexington. When Johnson's people found me, showed me a photo of them." His voice broke. "I did what they asked. I thought I was protecting them. And now? Johnson killed a man in front of me, made his wife watch. Said that's what happens to people who don't follow orders." His eyes met mine, hollow with grief. I realized then he'd never intended to keep his word about my family. They're probably already dead. I considered what he was telling me. It aligned with the conversation we'd overheard in the mining tunnel, Johnson using people as expendable assets. Whether Marcus was telling the complete truth or not, his fear of Johnson seemed genuine. "If you want to make amends," I said, "I need something specific from you." I explained my plan. Marcus would approach Johnson's group as if escaping from us, claiming we had discovered his betrayal. He would feed them certain information, that we were concentrated at the main entrance, that our supplies were running low, that morale was breaking, all false but believable. It's dangerous, I admitted. If he suspects you're double-crossing him, I'll do it, Marcus said without hesitation. For my family, even if they're gone, and for what I did to everyone here. With our plans in place, we moved to our positions and waited. My team navigated the complex network of natural passages and mining tunnels, using the map from the hunting cabin combined with my memory of what we'd overheard. We found a good observation point overlooking a larger chamber that seemed to serve as Johnson's base of operations. From our hidden vantage point, we counted 17 people, mostly men, but a few women, all armed with hunting rifles or handguns. They had decent supplies, food, ammunition, medical equipment, clearly gathered from raiding other survivor groups. Johnson himself paced near the center, checking a crude map spread on a makeshift table. We watched as Marcus was brought in, looking appropriately disheveled as if he'd fled in haste. Johnson interrogated him roughly, but Marcus stuck to our script. I could see Johnson nodding as he heard what he expected to hear, that I was behaving predictably, defending the most obvious approach. After Marcus's information was extracted, Johnson gathered his people for a briefing. They would attack in 2 waves, the main force at the central entrance as a distraction, while a smaller team seized the water source. Classic military strategy, dividing our attention and resources. Once they departed, leaving only 2 guards with their supplies, we retreated to a safe distance to plan our next move. We need to warn the others, Sarah whispered. They're already prepared, I assured her. But we can do more than warn. We can divide Johnson's forces even further. Using our knowledge of the cave system's acoustics, we set up a series of small rock falls in distant passages. Nothing dangerous, just enough to create sounds that would echo confusingly throughout the tunnels. Cave acoustics can play tricks on even experienced ears, making it impossible to pinpoint sound sources accurately. Then we circled back toward our main chamber, taking a roundabout route that would put us in position to observe Johnson's attack without being caught in it. We arrived just in time to see his main force approaching the central entrance. The sheriff's team had done their job perfectly. From a distance, it looked like our full group was there, but half were just bundles of supplies arranged to mimic resting people. The actual defenders were positioned strategically behind natural barriers, the sheriff himself visible in the center as if directing defense. Johnson's larger force approached cautiously but with confidence, using the mining tunnels for cover until they were within 50 yards of the entrance. I recognized Johnson immediately, taller than the others, distinctive beard, moving with the purposeful grace of someone comfortable in cave environments. Seeing him in person again after all these years stirred complicated emotions. Respect for his skills mixed with deep distrust of what he'd become. Just as they prepared to rush the entrance, our rockfall distractions triggered. Confusing echoes reverberated through the tunnels, making it sound like movement was coming from multiple directions. Johnson's group hesitated, several looking back nervously. "It's a trap!" someone shouted, and suddenly half of Johnson's main force broke formation, turning to secure their flanks against non-existent threats. Johnson tried to restore order, but the damage was done. His carefully planned assault had fragmented into confused clusters of people facing different directions. The sheriff seized the moment, leading a strategic withdrawal deeper into the tunnels, leaving just enough visible movement to keep Johnson's attention fixed on them rather than searching for other passages. Meanwhile, Davis's team would be implementing their part of the plan at the water source, making it appear briefly defended before disappearing into side passages, leading Johnson's second team on a frustrating chase through dead ends and loop routes I'd mapped years ago. Our strategy was working perfectly. Rather than a direct confrontation we couldn't win, we were using the cave itself as our primary weapon, exploiting our superior knowledge of its layout and features to exhaust and divide our opponents. I led my small team toward the rendezvous point where all 3 of our groups would eventually converge, a narrow passage that led toward the thermal chamber, but had a defensible choke point. Along the way, we passed several of the sheriff's people, confirming through whispered exchanges that everyone was executing their assignments as planned. We had nearly reached the rendezvous when I heard someone approaching rapidly from behind. I turned to see Kevin, the college student who had returned with Marcus, running toward us with panic evident in every movement. "They've got Marcus," he gasped when he reached us. Johnson figured it out, said Marcus was too cooperative. They're going to make an example of him. This wasn't part of the plan. I had known Marcus was taking a risk, but I had calculated that Johnson would be too focused on the attack to question his intelligence carefully. I had been wrong. Where? I demanded. Central chamber. Johnson's taking his core team back there, while the others continue searching. I made a quick decision. Danielle, take the others to the rendezvous. Tell Davis and the sheriff what's happened. I'm going back for Marcus. That's exactly what Johnson would expect you to do. Danielle objected. He's counting on your hero complex, just like he said. She was right, but that didn't change my decision. Sometimes being predictable is the right move. The rest of you stick to the plan. Keep our people safe. Before they could argue further, I was moving back through the passages, taking a different route that would bring me to the central chamber from above. There was a narrow crevice in the ceiling that I'd noted during our initial exploration. Barely visible unless you knew to look for it, but large enough for a person to access with the right technique. I reached the hidden observation point, just as Johnson and 4 of his people entered the chamber with Marcus between them, hands bound. They forced him to his knees in the center of the space. Johnson paced around him, speaking too quietly for me to hear clearly, but his threatening posture was unmistakable. From my position, I could see most of our main chamber was empty now. The sheriff's team had successfully withdrawn as planned. But Johnson didn't seem concerned about that. His focus was entirely on Marcus, who knelt with his head bowed. I assessed the situation rapidly. 5 armed hostiles, 1 hostage, limited angles of approach. Any direct rescue attempt would likely get both Marcus and myself killed. I needed a different strategy. Then I noticed something Johnson couldn't see from his position. A slight movement in one of the side passages. Someone else was watching. As they shifted position, I caught a glimpse of the sheriff's distinctive jacket. He had also returned, rather than proceeding to the rendezvous. Our eyes met across the chamber, and in that moment, I knew we were thinking the same thing. We needed a distraction big enough to cover a rescue, but controlled enough not to risk a cave-in. And we needed perfect timing. The sheriff nodded slightly, then disappeared back into the passage. I knew what he was doing, retrieving the emergency flares we'd salvaged from the town's hardware store. They would create intense light and smoke, temporarily blinding anyone looking directly at them. I repositioned myself, preparing for a controlled descent into the chamber. The rough rock offered good handholds, and I'd made similar climbs hundreds of times in rescue operations. Timing would be everything. Just as Johnson raised his handgun toward Marcus, the first flare ignited in the passage opposite my position, sending a burst of blinding red light across the chamber. Johnson and his people instinctively turned toward it, shielding their eyes. I dropped silently to the floor behind them, closing the distance to Marcus in 3 quick steps. One sharp tug broke his zip tie restraints. They hadn't been secured properly, an amateur mistake. As a second flare ignited to our left, I pulled Marcus toward a low crawl space hidden behind a stalagmite formation. Johnson recovered quickly, firing blindly in our direction. But we were already in the confined space where they couldn't follow easily. The passage was tight, designed for emergency egress during cave rescues, too small for anyone wearing bulky clothing or equipment, perfect for our needs. We crawled rapidly for about 50 feet before the passage opened enough to allow a crouching run. Behind us, I could hear Johnson shouting orders, their lights probing the crawl space but unable to track our path. "Why did you come back for me?" Marcus gasped as we moved. "After what I did? Because that's what we do," I replied simply. "No one gets left behind if I can help it, not even someone who betrayed us." We continued through a complex series of turns I'd memorized during earlier explorations, eventually emerging in a small chamber where the sheriff was waiting. He nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of a plan well executed. "Johnson's people will be searching for us," I said. "But they don't know about the thermal chamber. We need to join the others and figure out our next move." The sheriff led the way with Marcus between us. As we traveled, I observed Marcus carefully. His rescue seemed to have broken something inside him. The careful mask he'd maintained, the calculation behind his eyes. Now he just looked hollow, a man who had lost everything and knew it. "I need to know if there's anything else," I said quietly as we walked. "Anything else you haven't told us about Johnson's plans or capabilities?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. "There is one thing. Johnson has explosives, not just small charges for clearing passages. Serious demolition equipment. He was talking about collapsing entire sections of the cave if he couldn't get what he wanted. This was worse than I had anticipated. Johnson's background in mine safety would give him the knowledge to place charges effectively. He could potentially trap us all underground with no way out, or worse, cause catastrophic structural failure that would kill everyone." "Why would he risk that?" the sheriff asked. "He'd be endangering himself too." "Because he's desperate," I realized aloud. "The surface is uninhabitable. Underground space is the only viable real estate left. He's trying to secure territory, and if he can't have it, he'll make sure no one else does either." We reached the narrow crack that led to the thermal chamber, carefully navigating the tight space one at a time. Inside, Rodriguez had organized everything efficiently. The children were settled in a dry area away from the underground lake. The elderly were resting comfortably in the warmer section, and supplies were neatly arranged for easy access. Lisa approached immediately, her medical kit ready. "Any injuries?" "We're fine," I assured her, then nodded toward Marcus. But he could use some looking over. As Lisa took Marcus aside, I gathered the other leaders to update them on the situation. Johnson now knew our main chamber was largely empty, which meant he would soon realize we had another base he didn't know about. And with explosives at his disposal, the threat level had increased dramatically. "We need a more permanent solution," Davis said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "We can't keep playing hide-and-seek in these tunnels forever." He was right. What had begun as a short-term survival situation was evolving into something more enduring. The surface remained uninhabitable according to our last radio reports. Whatever had triggered this catastrophic freeze showed no signs of abating. We needed not just to survive the next attack, but to establish sustainable security for weeks or months to come. I found myself drawn to the edge of the underground lake, staring into its dark waters. Something about its presence here, so far underground, felt significant. Water always finds a way through, around, or under obstacles, like people determined to survive. "Echo?" Danielle's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "What are you thinking?" I turned to face the group that had gathered around me, waiting for direction. These people trusted me with their lives because of my specialized knowledge. But what we faced now went beyond cave rescue expertise. We needed a different kind of solution. "I'm thinking it's time we stopped reacting and started acting," I said. "Johnson believes he's hunting us. I think it's time we change that dynamic." As midnight approached on our watches, I spread out the combined maps we'd gathered: the original Cumberland Caves tourism map, the geological survey from the hunting cabin, and our own hand-drawn additions. Together, they revealed a complex, three-dimensional network of natural caverns and man-made tunnels stretching for miles. "Johnson knows these parts," I said, indicating the main tourist sections and mining tunnels. "But he doesn't know about this." My finger traced the thermal chamber and the three unexplored passages leading from it. One of these has to connect back to the mining section at some point. If we can find that connection, we could circle behind him again. Davis completed my thought. "But this time with our full group, not just a scouting party." "Exactly. And I have an idea about how to deal with his explosives too." As I outlined my plan, I noticed Marcus sitting alone at the edge of our group, listening intently. His expression had changed from hollow defeat to something more difficult to read, perhaps the first stirrings of hope, or perhaps simply resignation to whatever came next. What he didn't know yet was that he would play a crucial role in what I had planned. Not as bait this time, but as something far more important. A bridge between opposing sides who might, under different circumstances, have been allies rather than enemies. Because underground, When the world above has frozen solid, old grievances matter less than shared knowledge and skills. And I had begun to suspect that Johnson's raiding wasn't just about supplies or territory. It was about finding people with the right expertise to survive long-term in this new reality. People like me. People like Marcus. People who understood that in the darkness beneath a frozen world, humanity's best hope lay in cooperation rather than conflict. As I finished explaining my plan, I caught Lisa watching me with that same unreadable expression I'd noticed earlier. When the group dispersed to prepare, she approached me again. "You're not just thinking about defeating Johnson anymore," she observed. "You're thinking about what comes after." I nodded slowly. The world has changed. We need to change with it if we're going to survive. And Johnson, after everything he's done, I looked toward the dark water of the underground lake, remembering Johnson as he had been before the pitfall. Competent, dedicated, driven by the same desire to save lives that motivated me. Somewhere beneath his current ruthlessness, that person might still exist. "I think Johnson and I have been fighting the same battle from opposite directions," I said finally. "If I can make him see that, maybe we all have a better chance." Lisa touched my arm briefly. "Just remember, Echo, some people can't be reached no matter how deep you're willing to go to find them." Her warning stayed with me as I moved through our group, checking preparations, answering questions, reassuring the frightened. She was right to be cautious. But in my experience, most people can be reached if you understand what drives them. Johnson was driven by survival, just as I was. The difference was in our methods, not our ultimate goal. As I prepared to lead our exploration of the uncharted passage that would hopefully connect back to the mining tunnels, I found Marcus waiting for me at the entrance. "I want to help," he said simply. "Whatever you're planning with Johnson, I want to be part of it." I studied him carefully. Why? Because I've seen both sides now. I've seen what fear makes people do, what it made me do. His eyes held steady, for the first time since his return. Maybe I can help others avoid the same mistakes. I nodded slowly. "Then gear up. We leave in 20 minutes. As he moved away to prepare, I found myself thinking about the maps spread out behind me with their intricate network of passages both discovered and yet to be explored. In many ways, they resembled the complex moral landscape we were all navigating in this new frozen world, full of hidden dangers, unexpected connections, and occasionally, warm sanctuaries in the midst of cold darkness. The path forward wouldn't be straight or simple, but underground, that was rarely the case anyway. I led our exploration team into the unknown passage extending from the thermal chamber. Our group consisted of 5 people. Myself, Danielle with her geological expertise, Sarah for her natural caving ability, Davis for security, and Marcus, whose presence raised eyebrows but whose knowledge of Johnson's operations could prove invaluable. The passage began as a narrow crawlway that gradually widened into a walking passage. Unlike the cool, damp tunnels of the upper cave system, this corridor maintained the pleasant warmth of the thermal chamber. The walls were dry to the touch, and in places, crystalline formations caught our headlamps, scattering light in rainbow patterns. These formations are rare, Danielle explained, examining a cluster of delicate crystal needles. They only form in very stable geological environments with consistent temperature and humidity. "What does that tell us?" I asked, always looking for practical implications. "That this section has been undisturbed for thousands of years. No flooding, no significant seismic activity. It's stable." Stability was exactly what we needed right now. As we progressed, I kept a mental map of our route relative to what we knew of the mining tunnels above. If my calculations were correct, we were traveling roughly parallel to Johnson's territory, but at a lower level. After about an hour of steady progress, the passage split into 2 branches. The left fork continued level, while the right began a gentle upward slope. I knelt to study the floor, looking for any sign of water flow that might indicate which passage would more likely connect to known areas. "The right fork," Marcus said suddenly. When I was with Johnson's group, they mentioned exploring a deep shaft that dropped off from the lowest mining level. They couldn't reach the bottom, but they threw rocks down and heard water. I looked at him with new appreciation. That could be our thermal lake. If so, the right passage might lead us up to that shaft. We took the ascending route, which gradually steepened until we were using hand and foot climbing techniques on what amounted to a natural staircase of rock ledges. The passage narrowed in places, forcing us to turn sideways to squeeze through, then opened into small chambers before narrowing again. 3 hours into our exploration, with everyone growing tired, we reached a significant vertical shaft. Unlike natural cave passages, this was clearly man-made, a mining ventilation shaft or exploratory bore that had been abandoned. Old wooden support beams, now fossilized with mineral deposits, lined portions of the circular hole that extended upward beyond our light beams. "This has to be it," Davis said, playing his light around the shaft's circumference. The shaft Johnson's people found from above. I examined the walls carefully. There were rusted metal rungs embedded in the rock at regular intervals, an old miner's ladder. They looked ancient and unreliable, but they were our most direct route upward. "I'll test them," I said, reaching for the lowest rung. It held my weight when I pulled on it, though it creaked ominously. "Is this really our best option?" Sarah asked, eyeing the corroded metal skeptically. "Speed matters now," I replied. "Johnson will be consolidating his position after our earlier encounter. We need to circle behind him before he has time to set up proper defenses." I climbed first, testing each rung carefully before trusting it with my full weight. Some were solid, others worryingly loose. I called down warnings about the worst ones. The shaft extended upward for about 60 feet before opening into a horizontal mining tunnel that looked to have been actively used in the past few weeks. Fresh footprints in the dust, modern food wrappers, a discarded light stick. "We're in their territory now," I whispered once everyone had made the climb. "From here on, absolute silence is essential." We moved cautiously through the mining tunnel, which showed increasingly clear signs of Johnson's group. At one junction, we found a crude map scratched into the wall with chalk, marking routes to what they labeled as base and water. Marcus studied the markings. "Their main base is about half a mile that way," he indicated with a nod. "But it looks like they've established a secondary position closer to your water source." This matched what we'd observed during our earlier reconnaissance. Johnson was spreading his forces, likely anticipating that we might try to reclaim the main chamber. What he couldn't know was that we had something more valuable now, the thermal chamber with its own water source and stable environment. We proceeded toward their main base, moving with the careful silence that experienced cavers develop. Sound travels deceptively in caves, sometimes carrying for vast distances while being muffled just around corners. We communicated with hand signals and the occasional whispered word when necessary. As we approached what Marcus indicated was their main area, we began to hear voices. I signaled for everyone to hold position, while I crept forward alone to assess the situation. The tunnel opened into a large chamber that had clearly been a major mining operation at some point. Old equipment stood rusting along the walls. Battery-powered lanterns created pools of light amid the darkness. Johnson's group had established a surprisingly organized camp. Sleeping areas were arranged along one wall. Supplies were neatly stacked and apparently inventoried. A crude but effective ventilation system had been rigged, using plastic sheeting to direct airflow. These weren't just raiders. They were planning for long-term occupation. Johnson himself sat at a makeshift table with 3 others, studying what appeared to be technical diagrams. Even from a distance, I could recognize demolition plans. The explosives Marcus had warned us about weren't just for clearing passages. They were examining structural weak points in the cave system. I returned to my group and whispered our findings. "They're planning something big, possibly trying to collapse sections to isolate territories." "That could destabilize the entire system," Danielle replied, alarm evident even in her whisper. "Caves this extensive are interconnected through cracks and water channels we can't even see. A major collapse could trigger secondary failures throughout." Then we need to stop them, Davis said, hand moving to the knife at his belt, the closest thing to a weapon we had brought. I shook my head. Not by force. We're outnumbered and outgunned. We need a different approach. I outlined a new plan, adapting to what we'd discovered. Instead of a direct confrontation, we would use our superior knowledge of the cave system to isolate Johnson from his explosives and most of his group. Then I would approach him for negotiation, not from weakness, but from a position of control. Marcus, you know where they store the explosives? I asked. He nodded. Secondary chamber about 100 yards from their main area, usually guarded by 1 or 2 people. Danielle, based on what you saw of their ventilation setup, could we redirect airflow to that chamber? She thought for a moment. Probably. Why? Because airflow is how we'll control the situation. I explained the scientific principle we would exploit. Caves naturally maintain carbon dioxide levels through air exchange with the surface. Disrupt that flow in a confined space and CO2 builds up quickly, especially with multiple people breathing. Not enough to be lethal, but enough to cause drowsiness and confusion, a technique sometimes used in cave rescue to calm panicked victims. We backtracked to a junction where we had noticed a natural chimney effect in the airflow, then carefully rearranged some of the plastic sheeting Johnson's group had installed for their ventilation. The effect wouldn't be immediate, but within an hour, fresh air would be flowing away from their explosives chamber while stale air accumulated. Next, we needed to separate Johnson from the majority of his group. Marcus provided crucial information about their patrol schedules and routes, allowing us to identify a time window when Johnson routinely checked their secondary position with just 2 guards. If we time it right, we can effectively cut off his return route without him realizing it, I explained. Not permanently, but long enough for a conversation. We positioned ourselves strategically and waited. The mining tunnels were eerily quiet, except for the occasional distant voice or footstep. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes according to Sarah's watch, we saw movement in the main tunnel. Johnson and 2 armed men walked past our hidden position, heading toward the secondary site as predicted. Once they had passed, Davis and Sarah moved silently to implement the next phase, rearranging fallen debris to block the most direct return route. Not an obvious barrier, but enough to force Johnson to take a longer alternative path that would lead right to where I would be waiting. Meanwhile, Danielle and Marcus headed toward the explosives chamber to monitor the air quality situation. If our ventilation adjustment worked as planned, the guards there would be growing drowsy and less attentive. I positioned myself in a small side passage that connected to Johnson's likely return route. The plan was not to ambush him, but to reveal myself in a controlled manner that would allow for conversation before his guards could react aggressively. The wait was tense. Every distant sound made me question whether our adjustments had been discovered. Had we miscalculated? Had Johnson changed his routine? But eventually I heard footsteps approaching. 3 sets, moving at a steady pace. They paused briefly at the point where they would discover the blocked direct route, then continued along the diversion we had created. As Johnson rounded the corner into view, I stepped out from my hiding place, hands clearly visible and empty. His guards immediately raised their weapons, but Johnson himself showed no surprise, only a cold recognition. "Echo," he said, using my old nickname without warmth. "I was wondering when you'd make a direct appearance." "We need to talk, Johnson," I replied calmly. "Just you and me. About what you're planning with those explosives." His eyes narrowed, slightly. Confirmation that we'd discovered something important. "My men won't let you take me hostage." "I'm not here for that. I'm here to prevent a disaster none of us will survive." I nodded toward an alcove just large enough for 2 people. 5 minutes, then you can shoot me if you still want to." Johnson studied me for a long moment, then nodded to his guards. "Keep your weapons ready. If anything happens, kill him." We moved to the alcove, still within sight of his men, but with enough privacy for quiet conversation. Up close, Johnson looked older than I remembered, his face deeply lined, his beard streaked with gray. The years since the pitfall hadn't been kind to him. "You're planning to use explosives to collapse sections of the cave system," I said without preamble. It won't work the way you think. It will trigger cascading failures throughout the entire network. Everyone dies, including your people. You always did think you knew better than everyone else, he replied bitterly. That's what got those miners killed at Pitfall. 4 lived who would have died following standard protocols, I countered. I made the call I thought would save the most lives. And now? What call are you making now, Echo? I took a deep breath. This was the moment everything hinged on, whether I had correctly read Johnson's true motivations. I'm proposing an alliance, I said. Your group and mine, pooling resources and knowledge. We've found something you don't know about. A thermal chamber with its own water source large enough for 50 people, with stable geothermal heat. Interest flickered across his face despite his attempt to remain impassive. Warm, sustainable, shelter was the most valuable commodity in our frozen world. Why would you share that? He asked suspiciously. Because survival isn't a zero-sum game down here. Your mining knowledge complements our cave rescue expertise. Your group has skills my people need and vice versa. And the people I've killed? The supplies we've taken? You're just going to overlook that? I met his gaze steadily. No, but I'm willing to put it in context. The surface is uninhabitable. Traditional morality shifts when survival is at stake. I'm offering a path where further violence becomes unnecessary because everyone's basic needs are met. Johnson was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing my words against his own plans. I could almost see the calculations running behind. His eyes, resources, capabilities, long-term sustainability. Show me this thermal chamber, he said finally. Just me, with 2 of my people. If it's what you claim, we can discuss terms. It was a reasonable request and exactly what I had hoped for. I nodded my agreement. But my explosives stay where they are, he added. Insurance policy. Fair enough, I conceded, knowing that Danielle and Marcus were likely already ensuring those explosives would be unusable through their ventilation adjustments. We leave in 10 minutes. We returned to his guards, who looked relieved that their leader was unharmed. Johnson gave them instructions, sending one to select another team member for our expedition while the other remained with us. I used the opportunity to signal Davis, who was watching from a concealed position, to return to the others and prepare for our arrival. The journey to the thermal chamber took longer than our original exploration, as we needed to ensure Johnson couldn't easily retrace the route without guidance. He remained alert throughout, asking occasional questions about the geology or formation of specific passages, revealing a solid technical understanding that reinforced my belief in the potential value of an alliance. When we finally reached the vertical shaft that would take us down to the thermal passage, Johnson examined the ancient mining ladder with professional interest. Old ventilation shaft, he commented. Probably late 1800s construction. Can your people reinforce it? I asked, testing his willingness to contribute expertise. He nodded. Easily. We salvaged proper mining equipment from several abandoned operations. With the right supports, this could be made permanently stable. It was a small but significant moment. The first hint that he was already thinking in terms of contribution rather than just assessment. The descent was tense. I went first, then Johnson, followed by his 2 men. If he had wanted to eliminate me, this would have been a perfect opportunity. A fatal fall could easily be dismissed as an accident. But he followed the climbing protocols exactly, waiting for my signals before transferring his weight to each new rung. When we emerged into the thermal passage and felt the distinctly warmer air, Johnson's expression changed subtly. As a mine safety expert, he would understand immediately the significance of stable temperature in an underground environment. Geothermal? He asked, touching the warm, dry wall. Connected to a deeper system, according to our geological assessment, I confirmed. Temperature holds steady at around 65 degrees regardless of surface conditions. As we approached the main thermal chamber, I called ahead to alert our people. I had instructed them not to display, weapons or hostility, but to continue their normal activities. When we entered the vast space, Johnson stopped in his tracks, taking in the scene before him. The underground lake stretched into darkness on one side. Lights had been arranged to create distinct areas for sleeping, food preparation, and medical care. Children were being taught by Rodriguez in one corner. The elderly rested in the warmest section near the water. Everything spoke of organization, stability, and long-term thinking. "You've established a genuine community," Johnson said quietly. It wasn't a question. "We're trying to, but we lack certain expertise that your group has." I gestured toward the high ceiling. "We don't know how to reinforce properly for long-term habitation. We don't have the mining knowledge to expand safely or create proper ventilation systems." Johnson walked slowly around the perimeter of the chamber, examining the limestone formations, testing the water temperature, assessing the natural airflow. His men stayed close, visibly uncomfortable among so many strangers, but Johnson himself seemed almost at ease. When he had completed his circuit, he returned to where I waited. "This changes things," he admitted. "This space could support everyone, your people and mine, with room to expand through those other passages." He nodded toward the 3 additional tunnels we had identified but not yet explored. "That's what I'm proposing," I confirmed. "A combined operation. Shared resources, shared expertise, shared security. My people have done things yours won't easily forgive. And they've developed skills that will help everyone survive. In time, balance can be restored." Johnson considered this, his expression unreadable. Finally, he asked, "Why did you really come back for Marcus? He betrayed you. In the world above, he'd be expendable." The question revealed more about Johnson than he probably intended. He was testing whether my moral framework could accommodate his more pragmatic approach to survival. "Because no one is expendable underground," I answered honestly. "Cave Rescue's first principle is that we leave no one behind if we can help it. That doesn't change just because the world above has. If anything, it becomes more important." Something shifted in Johnson's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of a shared value he had forgotten in the desperate weeks since the freeze began. He had been a rescue professional too, once. Those instincts don't disappear entirely, even when survival becomes the primary focus. "I need to consult with my core team," he said finally. "But provisionally, I'm open to discussing alliance terms." It was as much as I could have hoped for in this initial meeting. We established a neutral meeting point for further discussions and prepared for Johnson's return to his group. As they gathered their gear, Marcus approached cautiously. "Johnson," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "My family. Were they ever really with your group?" Johnson looked at him for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally. "That was a leverage tactic. I don't know what happened to them." Marcus absorbed this with remarkable composure. "Thank you for the truth," he said simply, then walked away. As I escorted Johnson and his men back to the vertical shaft, he asked, "One final question. The surface, have your radios picked up anything recent about conditions?" "Nothing definitive," I replied. "Last reports indicated continued sub-zero temperatures across the continent, major infrastructure collapse in urban centers, limited government functionality restricted to military installations, but that was over a week ago." He nodded thoughtfully. "We've intercepted similar transmissions. I think we need to prepare for a much longer underground existence than anyone initially expected." Once they had departed, climbing back up toward the mining levels, I returned to brief our leadership council on the negotiations. The reactions were mixed: skepticism from Davis, cautious optimism from Danielle, practical questions from Lisa about medical resource sharing. "Can we really trust him?" the sheriff asked, giving voice to everyone's primary concern. "Trust is something we'll build gradually," I replied. "But I believe Johnson is rational enough to see the benefits of cooperation over conflict when presented with a viable alternative." Over the next 3 days, we conducted careful negotiations with small delegations meeting at the neutral point we had established. The process was delicate, with setbacks and tense moments, but gradually a framework emerged. Johnson's group would integrate with ours in the thermal chamber. Their mining expertise would be used to expand and reinforce our living space. In exchange, they would share equally in all resources. On the fourth day, the integration began. Johnson's people arrived in small groups, visibly tense but under strict instructions to remain peaceful. Some of our people were openly hostile, particularly those who had lost family members during the initial freeze when raiders had targeted vulnerable survivors. But necessity created tolerance, if not immediate forgiveness. I worked closely with Johnson to establish a unified leadership structure that incorporated the strengths of both groups. His mining engineers immediately began assessing the thermal chamber for expansion possibilities. Our medical team, led by Lisa, created a comprehensive health screening process for all new arrivals. Most promising was the discovery that several of Johnson's people had specialized skills we desperately needed. A hydroponic farming expert, an electrician who thought he could rig a small power generation system using the thermal water flow, a former military communications officer who might be able to establish more reliable radio contact with other survivor groups. 2 weeks after our initial confrontation, our combined community had begun to function as a cohesive unit. The thermal chamber had been expanded into adjacent natural caverns, nearly doubling our living space. Small hydroponics gardens were being established using seeds and equipment salvaged from various locations. A rudimentary power system provided limited electricity for essential medical equipment and communications. Most significantly, exploration teams had mapped 2 of the 3 passages leading from the thermal chamber, discovering additional geothermal features and a possible route to the surface that would emerge several miles from our original cave. Entrance potentially giving us access to new scavenging territory when spring eventually arrived, if it ever did. Johnson and I developed a working relationship that, while not exactly friendship, contained a mutual respect born of shared expertise and common purpose. One evening, as we reviewed expansion plans together, he brought up the pitfall incident, directly for the first time since our reunion. I was wrong about what happened there, he admitted, studying the cave map before us rather than meeting my eyes. I was too focused on protocols, not enough on the specific situation. Your approach saved lives. We were both trying to do the right thing, I replied. Just from different directions. He nodded slowly. Different directions, but the same destination. Maybe that's the lesson we needed to remember when the world froze. 1 month after the catastrophic freeze began, our underground community numbered 54 people. We had established sustainable systems for water, food rationing, waste management, and security. The radio operator had made contact with 3 other survivor groups in different cave systems across Kentucky and Tennessee, opening the possibility of knowledge exchange and eventual trade networks. The world above remained locked in ice according to the fragmented reports we could gather. But underground, humanity was adapting. Children were being educated in geology, hydrology, and survival skills alongside traditional subjects. Medical knowledge was being preserved and expanded. Cultural traditions were maintained through storytelling and music in the evenings, the sounds echoing beautifully off the limestone walls of our thermal chamber. Yesterday, for the first time since the freeze began, our surface monitoring team reported a brief temperature increase, just a few hours where readings climbed above freezing before plunging again. Not enough to matter practically, but enough to wonder if this ice age might eventually relent, might be a severe climate correction rather than a permanent new reality. Whether temporary or permanent, the frozen world had changed us all. I had begun as a cave rescue specialist whose expertise suddenly became crucial for immediate survival. Now, I found myself helping to build something that might endure for generations, an underground civilization adapted to a harsh new reality. The skills that once seemed specialized had become the foundation for a new society. The darkness that many once feared had become our sanctuary, and the people who had been strangers thrust together by disaster had become a community bound by shared survival and cautious hope. If you're watching this record I've created, it means our little underground civilization survived long enough to preserve our story. And if we made it, others did too. The world that emerges from this ice will need people who know how to build, from nothing. People who remember both what humanity lost and what it found when forced into the darkness. Look for cave entrances marked with our symbol, a circle with an echo wave. That's how you'll find us. That's how you'll find home. This isn't the end of our story, it's barely the beginning. Next time, I'll tell you about the underground city we're building and the network we're creating between survivor communities. Until then, if you're out there listening, know that even in the most absolute darkness, human ingenuity and cooperation can create light. We did. You can too.